Assalamu alaikum and welcome everyone to another episode of Danish TV's English language TV channel, and which is the global voice of our Center for Islam and Decoloniality. And uh, as I always say, once again, I mean, we just get one great guest after the other, but this one is a very special one because I myself have relied so extensively in understanding and following very meticulously what's going on in the situation in Palestine, and the way that our guest Nora-Barrows Friedman has documented that so meticulously. As I was saying, I have not seen such incredible journalism and reporting from anyone in the United States, and so that's who we have with us today. She's like I said, a fiercely independent journalist and one of the associate editors of the electronic Intifada. Again, a wonderful resource and website for people to educate themselves more on this issue. And of course, in light of the latest round of Israeli reign of terror that's taken place, I mean, I think this show, this particular topic has become even more pertinent. But of course, I also for Nora's also knowledge, want to inform her that the issue of pressuring Muslim countries beyond even the Arab world to kind of quote unquote normalize with an abnormal state of Israel has been immense, and that we have also tried to throughout roughly a few months ago during that period tried to kind of get people to really speak about how a horrendous move that would be. And
Yeah.
so and so one of our well, it's not, we've never had the complaint, but the viewership should know is that this issue right now is so pressing in terms of not just Pakistan, the larger Islamic world, and the world in general, about what's going on in Palestine, and what particularly what's going on now, and in the context of what many of us thought was the absolute still, I mean, they still are abandoning, but the abandonment of the Palestinians, their complete kind of erasure from even a facade of a peace process. So I think that one of the objectives of our show is to keep this issue alive, and our viewership to constantly be aware of what's going on, and just to kind of uh, give Nora an update. I mean, Pakistan, uh, which has made me very happy, Pakistan has had some of the largest demonstrations, Palestine solidarity demonstrations throughout the Muslim world. And why that's made me so happy is because all of the talk a few months ago of normalization and so on, I don't think we're going to hear about that anytime soon in Pakistan. So they were literally massive, and in many cities throughout the
Yeah.
country. So that was on an inspiring note. So, but what I wanted to do was perhaps two things with Nora today in the brief time that we have her with us is first of all, maybe if she could briefly speak about kind of her own kind of Jewish upbringing, and the type of positions that uh, not just herself but people of her generation growing up in America, and their views towards Israel and the larger question of Zionism, etc., and how that perhaps then that trajectory went to one of kind of her very critical independent journalism on Israel and Palestine, and with perhaps and somewhat of a analysis of why I mean, this is what people we always ask is why is this Western media, or specifically the American media, so skewed in its coverage. of the conflict. So I think we can do this in about 25 minutes. Uh, Although I could spend a whole lot of, and I wish I could have you for much longer. But
Yeah,
we'll have you again on certainly soon.
that'd be great.
So if we can begin, Nora, by I mean you talking about your own upbringing as a Jew in the United States, and kind of
Yeah.
what was the Zionist social imaginary for young Jews growing up, and your own personal perspective on it.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Junaid. So yeah, in the best tradition of other anti-Zionist families in the Jewish community here in the States and abroad, I was born into an anti-Zionist household, and my mother and father both came from families in New York who had found refuge in New York at the turn of the last century, fleeing pogroms.
Yeah.
And some of the families stayed in Eastern Europe, but were rounded up and killed in the Holocaust. But the parts of my family who made it here to the U.S., it was pre-Israel. It was the 1920s and 30s, and there wasn't much talk in the communities that my mom and dad grew up in about Zionism. That was kind of far, they were trying to assimilate into American culture,
Right.
And so there's of course a generational split. A lot of people in my parents' generation became Zionists, and have been very vocal in Jewish communal spaces for the last few decades. But luckily, my parents had
and sorry to interrupt, Nora.
Sure.
And was that because they started to become captured by the Zionist narrative that there's no way, there's never going to be a point where we're really going to be accepted.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, that's part of the American Zionist belief, is that we're in constant fear of our safety, and the only place to have a safe community is in the Zionist state of Israel. Of course, it's completely absurd, and it invalidates centuries and millennia of Jewish people being able to have community where they are in all parts of the world. So I grew up with very, very left-wing anti-Zionist politics at my dinner table. And so I'm very lucky that a lot of all of the anti-Zionist Jewish friends of mine, when it was this thing that they had to unlearn themselves as young adults, where they grew up in Zionist households, and then they were kind of indoctrinated into this like militaristic nationalist myth of Zionism and Israel, and it takes a lot of work to unlearn that as a Jewish person in the U.S. If that's been your background. But luckily, I didn't have to do that. And it was always, my mom would drag me to anti-war protests. She, as a child, I remember, I grew up in Berkeley, California, and I remember my mom taking me to the anti-apartheid South Africa protests at the UC Berkeley campus, and she would say, we as people living in this country who pay taxes, we have to demand that our government not support human rights abuses abroad, in our name. And whether that's apartheid South Africa or Palestine, we have to be, at the forefront of demanding from our lawmakers and of standing up, and as people of privilege in this country, who are white, who are from the middle class, whatever it is, we have a special responsibility, especially as Jewish people, to stand up and be in solidarity with other, oppressed communities. And so it was never, I never went on Birthright. Israel was not even like a part of our conversation.
Right, and just quickly,
Yeah.
but Birthright is kind of a program in which
Yes.
young Jews are taken to Israel to show.
Yeah, they get a free trip, a free 10-day trip to Israel, paid for by these organizations like the Sheldon Adelson organization, that pours, tons of millions of dollars into these propaganda efforts to try and get American, Canadian, and European young Jewish people to go to Israel, look at the spectacular country that, our people have built.
Right.
And the impetus is to try and get Jews to move to Israel as Zionist settlers.
Right.
So that was always, as a person who grew up in Berkeley, California, anti-war demonstrations, like boycotts of raisins. I remember in the 1980s because of the farm workers.
Right.
It was just, I was never gonna align with this like weird militaristic nationalist, ethno-supremacist state. It was just not a part of our conversations. And then in 2003, the invasion and occupation of Iraq happened, right after the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. And again, my like anti-war kind of, mode of operation kind of kicked in. And at that time, as we remember, that was also the beginning of the first couple of years of the second Intifada.
Right.
And I began working at a radio station here in Berkeley, and I just kind of like fell into Palestine reporting. And so that was about, 20 years now that I've been doing this.
Probably about 20 years since I've been following you. I mean, I know that I'm not sure if it's the one or the only one, but certainly on Flashpoints.
Yeah.
That I've followed you regularly because I've also been on with Dennis Bernstein.
Oh, good.
But I mean, your reporting there is. I mean, what I was really referring to, that if I need the daily updates, it's Nora-Barrows Friedman that I get it from. So,
thanks.
But
I mean, it was really important to me to, it was not. I didn't get hired at Flashpoint specifically to do Palestine reporting, but Dennis actually literally handed me a stack of news copy. Sometime, in early 2003, he was like, "Look, I got to focus on Iraq and Afghanistan. You take Palestine." And I was like, "Okay." But it immediately grabbed my focus. I was just immediately immersed in, this like Palestine is such a focus point. It is itself a flashpoint for indigenous resistance against settler colonial state policies. And so I read everything I could. I watched every documentary I could. I then started going to Palestine in 2004. And for about 8 years, I had been going 2-3 times a year to do reporting from there. And so really absorbing the situation.
How was that, Nora? I mean, going there yourself, the experience, your treatment, and would the Israelis have kind of an awareness of your political stance, that type of thing, or?
Yeah, I mean, I have this double privilege of having an American passport and Jewish identity.
Right.
So, unlike Palestinians, of course, or anyone with Arab and Muslim sounding names,
that's right.
It was relatively easy for me to get in and out. But the first time I went to Palestine, I was visiting the old city of Hebron, Khalil, in the southern occupied West Bank. And this is a place where, since 1994, settler groups, the most extremist, violent, genocidal settler groups, usually, people from Brooklyn, where my parents were from, have taken over Palestinian homes and have completely decimated the old city. And they've turned it into a settlement within, this Palestinian city.
Right.
And I remember walking in this, in this ethnically cleansed part of the old city, and seeing graffiti on one of the old shops that had been destroyed and closed by settlers, and they had graffitied "Gas the Arabs." And I remember, just I was like paralyzed with grief and rage. And the woman who was my mentor, the former director of the Middle East Children's Alliance, Barbara Lubin, she put her arm around me and she said, "Okay, great. You're angry? Great. Use it. Now you know." And since then, that was it. I mean, I used my privileged identity to go in and out of Palestine and report what I was seeing.
Right.
And since, and then I was at KPFA from 2003 to 2010. And ever since I've been at the Electronic Intifada. And really it is an honor and a great responsibility as an editor, as a reporter, to report what's actually happening, and to try and turn the inherent pro-Israel narrative and the bias that's baked into the pie of Western corporate media to favor Israel and its state policies over anything that Palestinians do or are.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, and before we get into that, the topic of that bias in the of the American coverage of Israel Palestine, I did want to finish this off with asking. It's probably clear that your generation, that the majority were sucked into the Zionist narrative. However, I did want you to speak about kind of what's been happening now over the past many years amongst Jews, and particularly young Jews, and what many of the Zionist elites are to speak about the crisis of Zionism, the crisis that they're facing, and that crisis is that perhaps their monopoly over the Zionist narrative, their monopoly, and they're able to monopolize that narrative and impose it on Jews in America is no longer as powerful. So if you could speak to that a little bit. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think now more than ever, the Israel lobby, and Israel lobby organizations are in a complete panic because their numbers are dropping and their narrative is being completely destroyed by young American anti-Zionist Jews. Who, like me, either grew up in anti-Zionist households or had like a moral awakening as young people when they saw this like growing intersectional solidarity, these movements of solidarity between the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, and the Palestinian Liberation Movement. And queer liberation, and women's liberation, and liberation of indigenous peoples here on this continent, all working to support each other and having this very explicit understanding of how Palestine is also a central focus of indigenous liberation, and how if you're for you can't cherry pick human rights. If you're for human rights and justice for indigenous people, then Palestine is part of that focus. And so, now more than ever, explicit anti-Zionist organizations in the United States, like Jewish Voice for Peace, is just skyrocketing in membership and support. Whereas, the Zionist Organization of America, Stand With Us, these very well-financed lobby organizations that are trying to, entice young Zionists on campus, with propaganda trips, like Birthright, but also, trying to create these atmospheres on U.S. campuses where they're trying to say that Zionism is an indigenous, movement for self-determination. They're like trying to use all the buzzwords they can to try and flip the narrative in their favor, and people aren't taking the bait. young
Right.
people in particular. They're like, what do we have to, or maybe our grandparents were, somewhat interested in Israel. What do we have to do with it? We're Americans,
Right.
we're like, we have Black Lives Matter signs, in our dorm rooms. There's no way that you can square that circle. So especially on college campuses, we're seeing this incredible organization by students working for Palestinian liberation, Palestinians, Jews, everyone working together.
Yes.
And then on the other side, you have these Israel lobby organizations who, as I said, are in a total panic, trying to pressure university administrations
Right.
to clamp down on Palestine solidarity activism, trying
Right.
to smear Palestine solidarity activists, including Jews, as anti-Semites,
Right.
as terrorist sympathizers, all of these scare tactics. And unfortunately, sometimes they work. I mean, I think university administrations, the administrators themselves are so, they're so like rigidly focused on donors, on
Yes.
getting prestige and not attracting any negative attention.
Right.
And unfortunately, they sometimes do the bidding. They capitulate to Israel lobby groups.
That's
But I
right.
think students are stronger than ever before, and young Jewish anti-Zionists are more vocal than ever before. So it's really encouraging to see.
Nora, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, also growing up on campuses there in Virginia and William Mary, we at the beginning, I mean, really post 9/11 environment, having these types of, and you can also obviously go back, and of course Chomsky speaks about this as well, going way back. But having any type of forums on this issue, you would it's a guarantee that whether they would be students or not, the Zionist lobby would have someone there to be heckling you, shouting at you, calling you a Nazi, etc. You could not do a normal event on this question with the same and students. In our first example, SJP students for justice in Palestine, we did. I mean, we were students, undergrads, get intimidated at times, and all of this and so on. But that has radically shifted. I mean, the kind of the student power and the way they are much more vocal, and kind of the whatever Zionist agent that's sent to these campuses, they are on the back foot now. But you're absolutely right. Then the pushback is coming from the administration.
Right.
To which the Zionists often have a lot of influence over.
That's right.
But no, I think that this was important to point out this shift, and especially amongst Jewish Americans, for audience to also understand that, because that's incredible, and I don't foresee any another future generation of young Jews all of a sudden then once again wanting to support a settler colonial state engaged in barbarism against an indigenous population. So I think this is a trend that will last and only get stronger, and that's a very hopeful sign for us. So the last topic, it's a huge topic, but I hope we can cover it maybe in about 5 minutes or so.
Sure.
But just the curiosity, well, much more than curiosity. The real bewilderment and confusion of why the coverage is so skewed in the United States, in the UK, on the Israel-Palestinian issue, when to people within, say, the Muslim world and other parts of the global South, it seems so obvious that this is kind of like it's a settler colonial military occupation, it's an anti-colonial struggle. But why don't American journalists get it? And so I don't know, a few your reflections now as being one of an independent journalist and seeing kind of what are the constraints that they're under, or why do they have such type of a perspective on the issue?
Yeah, well, briefly, the U.S. war machine, the U.S. machine of empire and imperialism depends on, as Chomsky says, the manufactured consent of media. So like you have a platform like CNN, for example, or MSNBC, owned by, MSNBC, of course, is, owned by General Electric. Like there are corporations that have vested interests in maintaining the partnership between the U.S. and client states like Israel, where you have to maintain, then, in order to manufacture this consent, you have to present the issue as a conflict between civilized Israelis and these savage Palestinians,
Right.
in order to get people to kind of buy into the narrative that the U.S. is trying to sell. And I mean, we could spend a whole hour talking about this kind of media complicity, but it's not just that. I think journalists, as someone from the journalism community, journalists they don't go to journalism school. They don't go to work at corporate media in order to sell this narrative.
Right.
They learn how to self-censor in order to get their stories printed or their broadcasts aired. Many journalists, who I've encountered many times in Palestine, working for corporate news agencies or broadcasting companies, say, like, yeah, of course we know what's going on, but my editor will not let me cover this and say apartheid or say ethnic cleansing or talk about the Nakba. The context is deliberately left out so that journalists can get their stories out and make a living. So this culture of self-censorship is real, and it's, you see what happens when, just this past week, a young journalist who was a student at Stanford and then got a news desk job at the Associated Press, at local, somewhere on the East Coast, I believe, wasn't covering Israel or, Palestine at all. The Stanford Republicans, which are basically a thug organization these days, they go after any Stanford student or member of faculty who speaks up in support of Palestinian rights or the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and they try to get them, as we call, canceled, right?
Right.
So the Stanford Republicans took note that a former Stanford student who was a member of Students for Justice in Palestine got this AP job as a news desk writer,
right,
and pressured the Associated Press to fire her, and they did.
Oh, wow.
And so there are these like witch hunt campaigns by organizations like the Stanford College Republicans or APAC or whatever, whoever it is, trying to scare young journalists, especially,
Right.
into just staying silent on Palestine, because if they ever want a job, they have to kind of toe the line. And it's damaging, but also you see this young journalist, Emily Wilder, she didn't stay silent. She didn't apologize for supporting Palestinian rights. In fact, just the opposite. She released a statement a few days ago saying, like, this is complete, just absurd, scare tactics. And I will not apologize for standing up for Palestinian rights. I won't apologize for my time at Stanford as a member of SJP. It's sad that the AP decided to fire me, but I'm not going to stop speaking out. So that's a real shift as well.
Incredible.
So yeah, we're seeing more and more of that.
I think that at the beginning of what you were saying is also absolutely crucial here, and I think that it's a mistake to see kind of just journalists or the media in general as divorced from the larger, what you were talking about, the U.S. Foreign policy and the way American hegemony in the Middle East has functioned, and the role of Israel in that, and media not just being an institution on its own, but again the connections that they have with the larger corporations and those
Yeah.
corporations and its connection to the state as well. I think that this is kind of the analysis that people that just miss, and then they just say, well, it's just the media,
Right.
and so on, and some journalists may have some bad views, or maybe even their
Right.
editors or something. And but I think that that was important that you emphasize that. Nora, I will really have to apologize because so that our viewers actually watch the whole show, I and don't stop watching after 5 minutes.
Of
I
course.
will have to cut us short this time, but I certainly hope we can have you back on because
Absolutely.
this has been just a pure delight and a treat
Oh,
and an
thank
honor
you.
for us to have you. So
Thank you. Yeah, and there's always so much to talk about when it comes to Palestine. So yeah, anytime.
absolutely. Thank you so much, Nora. Take care and goodbye.
Thank you so much, Junaid. Take care.